Oh, for the love of plasma crystals, Luminox grumbled, his massive scaled head bumping against the low ceiling of their makeshift shelter in the Neodragon district. This place is barely big enough to fit my tail, let alone our entire family. His mate, Celestara, shot him a look that could have melted titanium. Well, maybe if someone hadn't lost their job at the Interstellar Transport Authority, we wouldn't be living in this. Go ahead, say it, Luminox sighed, a small puff of smoke escaping his nostrils. This dump. The Neodragon district wasn't always like this. Once upon a time, it had been the crown jewel of New Terra colony, where dragons and humans lived side by side in harmony. But that was before the great economic collapse of 2157, which hit the dragon community particularly hard. Now, the once gleaming crystal spires were dulled with grime, and the anti-gravity platforms that kept their homes floating majestically in the air sputtered and sparked like faulty holiday lights. Their three hatchlings, Aurora, Nova, and Little Spark, huddled together in the corner, their scales dulled from lack of proper nutrition. Dragons needed a steady diet of energy crystals to maintain their legendary glow, but with prices skyrocketing and jobs scarce, many dragon families could barely afford the synthetic substitutes. Mama Spark whispered, his tiny voice barely louder than the hum of a malfunctioning power cell. I'm hungry. Celestara wrapped her iridescent wing around her youngest. I know, little one. We'll figure something out, she tried to sound confident, but her voice wavered like a failing force field. Meanwhile, on the human side of the district, 10-year-old Asher Martinez pressed his face against his bedroom window, watching the dragon family with growing concern. His room in the Martinez family's modest apartment offered a perfect view of their shelter, and he'd been observing them for days. They're getting worse, he muttered to himself, his breath fogging up the glass. His dark eyes reflected the dim glow of the dragon scales, now barely brighter than a nightlight. Asher wasn't like most kids his age who spent their free time playing virtual reality games or racing hover scooters. No, he was what his teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, called an old soul with a young heart. He noticed things others missed, felt things others ignored, and right now, every fiber of his being told him those dragons needed help. The boy grabbed his tablet, pulling up an article about dragon physiology. Energy crystal deficiency, he read aloud, scrolling through the symptoms. Dulled scales, decreased body temperature, lethargy. His eyes widened as he matched each symptom to what he'd observed in the dragon family. A sudden crash from the shelter made him jump. He watched as Luminox tried to catch a falling support beam, only to have it slip through his weakened grasp. The beam crashed into their already meager food storage, scattering their last few synthetic crystals across the floor. That's it, Asher declared, his young face set with determination. I can't watch this anymore. Someone has to do something, and that someone is going to be me. The next morning, Asher stood at the edge of the safety barrier separating the human residential zone from the Neodragon district. His heart pounded against his ribs like a malfunctioning anti-grav unit. The barrier wasn't really meant to keep anyone out, it was more of a suggestion than a rule, but crossing it still felt like breaking some unspoken law. Come on, Asher, he muttered to himself, clutching his backpack straps. They're just dragons. Really big, fire-breathing dragons who could accidentally step on you, he paused, reconsidering his pep talk. Not helping, brain. Taking a deep breath, he ducked under the holographic warning sign and made his way toward the dragon family's shelter. Up close, the situation looked even worse than from his window. The structure was a hodgepodge of salvaged materials. Damaged solar panels formed most of the walls, while what looked like an old spacecraft hull served as the roof. The whole thing leaned precariously to one side, held together by hope and possibly some questionable anti-gravity modifications. As Asher approached, he could hear voices from inside. But why can't we go to school anymore? That was definitely one of the younger dragons, Aurora, he thought, based on the slightly higher pitch. Because, sweetie, came Celestara's tired voice, the hover transport costs too many credits, and your father and I need to save every bit we can for food. Asher's foot caught on a piece of scrap metal, sending it clattering across the ground. The voices inside immediately went quiet. Who goes there? Luminox's deep voice boomed, though Asher noticed it lacked the usual resonance dragon voices carried. Show yourself. Taking another deep breath, Asher stepped into view of the shelter's entrance. Hi, I'm Asher. I live over there, he pointed toward his apartment building, then immediately felt silly, as if they couldn't see the massive residential complex. 3 tiny dragon heads poked out from behind their mother's protective wing. Nova, the middle child, sneezed, producing a spark that would have been impressive if it hadn't looked so weak. A human child, Celestara's expression softened, though confusion clearly showed in her dimmed crystal eyes. "What brings you to our humble home?" "I've been watching you," Asher blurted out, then immediately cringed. "That came out wrong. I mean, I've noticed you from my window and well." He fumbled with his backpack zipper, hands shaking slightly. Luminox stepped forward, and despite his weakened state, his presence was still impressive. "Young human, while we appreciate any concern, we don't need energy crystals." Asher finally managed to open his bag, pulling out a small container. "Real ones, not the synthetic stuff. I've been saving them for my science project, but you need them more than I do." The 3 hatchlings' eyes widened simultaneously, their dulled scales flickering briefly with interest. Even Luminox and Celestara couldn't hide their surprise or their hunger. "That's very kind," Celestara said carefully, "but we couldn't possibly accept." "Please," Asher interrupted, holding out the container. "My mom always says that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help when you need it. And I think you need it." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the soft whirring of failing anti-gravity generators in the distance. Then little Spark, the youngest hatchling, wiggled free from his mother's wing and approached Asher. His movements were slow and slightly wobbly, but his eyes never left the container of crystals. "They're pretty," Spark said softly, now close enough that Asher could feel the slight warmth radiating from his scales, "like stars in a bottle." Luminox and Celestara exchanged a look, one of those parent looks that seemed to contain an entire conversation. Finally, Luminox nodded. "Perhaps," he said, his voice softer now, "we could invite our young friend in for tea. That is, if you'd like to stay, Asher." Asher's face broke into a wide grin. "I'd love to. And wait until you see what else I brought." He reached back into his bag, pulling out a worn tablet. "It has all the local job listings downloaded. Maybe we could look through them together." For the first time in weeks, a genuine smile crossed Celestara's face. "You know what? I think this might be the beginning of a very interesting friendship." Back in his room that evening, Asher dumped out his piggy bank, or rather, his quantum savings pod, a gleaming cylinder that counted credits as they were added. He'd been saving for almost 2 years now, doing odd jobs around the colony, programming simple maintenance bots, helping elderly neighbors with their holo screens, and even walking the occasional pet plasma lizard. 257 credits, he mumbled, watching the holographic display hover above the pod. It was supposed to be for the new Neural Link gaming console everyone at school was talking about. The same console Tommy Parker bragged about getting last week, making sure everyone knew his parents had bought it the day it launched. Asher flopped back on his bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark constellations on his ceiling. The crystals he'd given the dragon family today had barely made a dent in their needs. He could see it in the way Aurora, Nova, and Spark had shared that single crystal, taking tiny bites and making it last as long as possible. What would Mom say, he wondered aloud, then chuckled because he already knew. Asher Martinez, colony hydroponics engineer and certified coolest mom ever, always told him that money was like water, it only had value when it flowed to where it was needed most. A soft chime from his window made him sit up. The environmental warning system was alerting everyone to an upcoming cold front. The colony's weather control systems usually kept things stable, but sometimes the harsh conditions of their planet broke through. Through the window, he could see Luminox trying to patch another hole in their shelter's roof. The dragon's movements were sluggish, his usual grace replaced by exhaustion. The synthetic crystals just weren't enough. Asher looked at his savings pod again. 257 credits would buy a lot of real energy crystals. Not enough to solve all their problems, but enough to keep the family fed for at least a few weeks. Maybe by then, some of those job applications they'd submitted would pan out. "Sorry, Neural Link," he sighed, picking up the pod. "Looks like you'll have to wait." The next morning, Asher practically ran to the crystal exchange, his savings pod tucked safely in his jacket. The grumpy exchange operator, Mr. Patel, raised an eyebrow when Asher asked to convert all his credits to premium-grade energy crystals. "That's a lot of crystals for such a small human," Mr. Patel commented, his cybernetic eye whirring as it scanned Asher's ID chip. "You sure about this?" "Absolutely," Asher replied, standing as tall as his 10-year-old frame would allow. And could you package them in small portions? It's easier to store them that way. Mr. Patel's organic eye twinkled knowingly. Would these crystals happen to be heading toward the Neodragon district? Asher froze. Is that a problem? The old shopkeeper smiled, reaching under his counter. No, young man. In fact, he pulled out several additional crystal packets. These were about to expire anyway. I'd hate to see them go to waste. By the time Asher reached the dragon family's shelter, his backpack was bulging with carefully wrapped crystal packets. He found Luminox attempting to fix their malfunctioning heat regulator, while Celestara tried to entertain the hatchlings with stories of their ancestors' great space migrations. Delivery for the most awesome dragon family in New Terra colony, Asher announced, swinging his backpack around. Asher, the three hatchlings bounded over, their scales already a bit brighter from yesterday's crystal. As he unzipped his backpack and revealed its contents, the entire family fell silent. Celestara's eyes welled up with tears that sparkled like tiny diamonds. Child Luminox rumbled, his voice thick with emotion. This must have cost. Hey, what's money for if not buying dragon food? Asher grinned, trying to sound casual despite the lump in his throat. Besides, I hear neural link consoles rot your brain anyway. Spark tilted his head. What's a neural link? Nothing important, Asher replied, watching as Aurora and Nova carefully distributed the crystals. Nothing important at all. No one saw the meteor coming. New Terra colony's defense systems were designed to track and deflect space debris, but this one somehow slipped through. The first warning came when the colony's artificial atmosphere began fluctuating wildly. Warning. Atmospheric breach detected in sectors 7 through 12. All residents please proceed to emergency shelters immediately, the colony's AI announced, its usually calm voice carrying an edge of urgency that made everyone's hair stand on end. Asher jolted awake to the sound of blaring alarms and his mother's voice. Asher, get your emergency pack. We need to move. The boy scrambled out of bed, his heart racing. Through his window he could see chaos unfolding. The meteor had struck one of the main atmospheric generators, creating a cascading failure throughout the colony's life support systems. Emergency force fields were activating, but they wouldn't hold forever. Mom, Asher called out, grabbing his pre-packed emergency bag. What about the dragons? Asher Martinez was already at their apartment door, checking the seals on their portable oxygen masks. The dragon shelter is in the other direction from the emergency bunker, honey. I'm sure they've been notified. But Asher's face had gone pale. Mom, their shelter doesn't have an emergency notification system. They disconnected it to save power. Before Lisa could respond, a violent tremor shook the building. Outside, the artificial sky flickered ominously, showing glimpses of the actual space beyond their protected bubble. We have to help them, Asher pleaded, already moving toward the door. Asher Martinez, don't you dare. Lisa began, but another tremor cut her off, this one strong enough to crack their reinforced windows. The emergency force fields kicked in just in time to prevent a breach. 7 minutes until critical atmospheric failure, the AI announced cheerfully, as if it were sharing a recipe for space cookies. Lisa looked at her son, then at the cracking window, then back at her son. Your father is going to kill me, she muttered, activating her emergency beacon. Command center? This is Engineer Martinez. We have civilians without emergency alerts in the Neodragon district, requesting immediate assistance. The response crackled through with static negative, Engineer Martinez. All emergency personnel are engaged with core systems. The Dragon sector is already marked for evacuation. But they don't know, Asher shouted at the comm unit. They're too weak to fly to safety on their own. Another violent shake rattled the building. Through the window, they could see parts of the colony's outer shell beginning to peel away like old paint. 6 minutes until critical atmospheric failure, the AI updated, still sounding inappropriately cheerful. Lisa grabbed Asher's hand. We run. Together. No arguments. They burst out of their apartment into chaos. The emergency lights cast everything in a surreal red glow as people rushed toward the designated shelters. But the Martinez family turned the other way, fighting against the crowd. Look, Asher pointed ahead. The anti-gravity generators in the Neodragon district were failing completely now. The makeshift homes were starting to list dangerously, some already crashing to the ground. They reached the dragon family's shelter just as another tremor hit. The structure groaned ominously, its patchwork walls threatening to cave in at any moment. Luminox. Celestara, Asher shouted, banging on the door. You need to get out. The door creaked open, revealing the dragon family huddled together. The hatchlings were trembling, their scales almost completely dim now. The emergency shelters, Lisa explained quickly. They're designed for dragons too. But we have to move now. We can't, Celestara said, her voice breaking. We're too weak to fly, and the little ones. 4 minutes until critical atmospheric failure, the AI chimed in helpfully. Another section of the colony's shell tore away, larger this time. The emergency force fields were spreading thin, creating visible gaps in their coverage. The transport tubes, Lisa suddenly exclaimed. If we can get to the maintenance access point, we can ride them to the shelter. But the nearest access point is half a kilometer away, Luminox rumbled. We'll never make it in time, not in our condition. A piece of debris crashed nearby, making everyone jump. The artificial sky was more space than sky now, with only the flickering force fields keeping them alive. 3 minutes until critical atmospheric failure, the AI announced, as if commenting on the weather. Asher looked at the terrified hatchlings, then at his mother, then at the failing colony around them. Something clicked in his mind. The crystals, he shouted, rushing to his backpack. You don't need enough energy to fly, you just need enough to make it to the transport tube. He pulled out his last emergency stash of energy crystals, the ones he'd been saving for another crisis. But if this wasn't a crisis, what was? 2 minutes until critical atmospheric failure, the AI continued its cheery countdown. The colony shuddered again as Asher distributed the crystals. Eat fast. We don't have much time. As the dragons consumed the crystals, their scales began to brighten. Not to their full glory, but enough, maybe just enough. 1 minute until critical atmospheric failure, the AI announced, still somehow managing to sound like it was sharing exciting news about a bake sale. The race against time was on, with the colony literally falling apart around them. Would the energy boost be enough? Could they reach safety in time? The next few minutes would determine not just the fate of one unusual friendship, but the survival of them all. The energy crystals hit their system like rocket fuel. Luminox's scales blazed to life, shifting from dull gray to brilliant blue. Celestara's iridescent wings began to pulse with renewed strength. Even the hatchlings started to glow, their tiny bodies humming with power. 30 seconds, until critical atmospheric failure, the AI announced, practically bouncing with joy. Everyone on my back, now, Luminox commanded, lowering himself to the ground. His voice had regained its thunderous quality, making the very air vibrate. Lisa helped Asher scramble onto the massive dragon's back, then climbed up herself. Celestara gathered the hatchlings, her newly energized wings spreading wide. 20 seconds. The ground beneath them cracked. The entire colony seemed to be tearing itself apart, piece by piece. The emergency force fields were failing faster now, creating pockets of vacuum that sucked debris into space. Hold tight, Luminox roared. With a powerful thrust, he launched himself into the air, Celestara right beside him. The sudden acceleration pressed Asher against his mother as they soared through the chaos. 10 seconds. They could see the transport tube access point ahead, but between them and safety was a gauntlet of falling debris and failing force fields. A massive piece of the colony's outer shell broke free, tumbling toward them. 9 seconds. Luminox, Celestara shouted. Spiral formation. The two adult dragons began to spin around each other in perfect synchronization, creating a slipstream that helped them dodge the worst of the debris. Aurora, Nova, and Spark clung to their mother, their tiny wings helping to stabilize her flight. 8 seconds. A force field directly in their path flickered and died. The vacuum of space began pulling at them, trying to drag them into its deadly embrace. 7 seconds. Not today, Luminox bellowed. His scales blazed even brighter as he expelled a burst of plasma hot breath, creating a temporary barrier of superheated air that pushed back against the vacuum. 6 seconds. They were almost there. The access point was just ahead, its emergency lights beckoning like a lighthouse in a storm. 5 seconds. Another piece of debris. This one the size of a small shuttle, spun toward them. There was no time to dodge. 4 seconds. Kid Celestara called to her hatchlings. Remember what we practiced. The 3 young dragons took deep breaths and, in perfect unison, released their fire. Despite their small size, the combined heat was enough to break apart the debris into smaller, manageable pieces. 3 seconds. Luminox and Celestara dove through the gap created by their children's flames, banking hard toward the access point. 2 seconds. With a final burst of speed, they crashed through the access point's emergency doors, tumbling onto the platform just as the last force field failed behind them. The automatic blast doors slammed shut, sealing them safely inside the transport system. 1 second 0. Have a nice day, the AI concluded its countdown with inappropriate enthusiasm. For a moment, everyone lay there, panting and trembling. Then, suddenly, Spark started giggling. The sound was so unexpected, so purely joyful, that soon everyone joined in, humans and dragons alike, laughing in the face of their near demise. That Lisa gasped between laughs was either the bravest or craziest thing I've ever done. Why not both, Celestara suggested, nuzzling her hatchlings proudly. The transport tube's internal comm system crackled to life. This is emergency control. We're detecting multiple life signs at access point 7. Please identify. Engineer Asher Martinez, Lisa responded. Along with my son Asher, and she looked at the dragons with a warm smile, our family friends. Copy that. Stand by for emergency transport to Shelter Complex B. As the transport pod arrived to carry them to safety, Luminox turned to Asher. You saved us twice now, young human. First with your kindness, and now with your quick thinking. Asher shrugged, trying to look casual despite the enormous grin on his face. Hey, what are friends for? Friends, Aurora piped up. More like family. Nova nodded enthusiastically. Yeah, can we keep him, Mom? Dad? Please. Keep me, Asher laughed. I'm not a pet plasma lizard. No, Celestara agreed, wrapping a wing around both Asher and Lisa. You're much more important than that. As they boarded the transport pod, Asher noticed something amazing. The dragon's scales weren't just glowing now, they were shining brighter than he'd ever seen, pulsing with an inner light that seemed to come from something deeper than just the energy crystals. Your scales, he pointed out. They're so bright. Luminox smiled, a knowing look in his ancient eyes. That's because there are some things, young Asher, that provide more energy than any crystal. Courage. Friendship. Family. These are the most powerful forces in any colony on any world. Speaking of power, Lisa added, checking her portable scanner, those readings are off the charts. I think you just might have enough energy now to help with the colony repairs. The dragons exchanged determined looks. Their home might be damaged, but with their strength renewed and their family expanded, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, they had something better than synthetic crystals or emergency systems. They had each other. The next week, at New Terra colony, looked nothing like anyone expected. Instead of a massive reconstruction effort bogged down by bureaucracy and limited resources, something extraordinary happened. The dragon family, now restored to their full strength, became the catalyst for change that no one saw coming. Incoming plasma burst in Sector 4, the construction coordinator announced through the comm system. Clear the area. Luminox hovered in place, his massive wings creating gentle wind currents as he precisely aimed his plasma breath. The concentrated burst of energy hit the damaged atmospheric generator, instantly fusing the broken components back together. The repair would have taken human engineers weeks to complete with conventional tools. Perfect shot. Dad Aurora called out from where she and her siblings were helping to clear smaller debris. The 3 hatchlings had discovered they could use their combined flame breath to melt down damaged materials for recycling, turning potential space junk into valuable resources. Celestara, meanwhile, had found her calling as an emergency response coordinator. Her ability to fly through the colony's damaged sectors while carrying repair crews made her invaluable. Plus, it turned out that dragon scales naturally protected against radiation, making them perfect for working in areas still exposed to space. You know what the funny thing is, Asher said to his mother as they watched from the new combined human-dragon command center. None of this would have happened if they hadn't been so weak that day. Lisa nodded, making adjustments to the colony's power grid. Sometimes our lowest points lead us to our highest achievements. Speaking of which, the command center doors slid open, and Colony Administrator Sandra Powell walked in, followed by several council members. Her usually stern face broke into an unexpected smile. "The test results are in," she announced. "The new Dragon-human hybrid power system is 30% more efficient than our old grid. And the cultural integration program," she checked her tablet, "enrollment is off the charts. Everyone wants to learn about dragon culture now." "Too bad they didn't care when we were struggling," Luminox rumbled as he landed on the command center's reinforced platform. Administrator Powell had the grace to look embarrassed. "Yes, well, about that. The Council has unanimously voted to establish the Dragon-Human Partnership Initiative. Full integration of both communities, shared resources, cultural exchange programs," and she paused for effect, "a new position of Dragon Relations Director. If you're interested, Luminox." The massive dragon blinked in surprise. "Me? But just 2 weeks ago I couldn't even get a job as a cargo hauler." 2 weeks ago, we were blind," one of the council members spoke up. "It took a child to make us see." Everyone turned to look at Asher, who suddenly found his shoes very interesting. "I didn't do anything special," he mumbled. "Anyone would have helped if they'd noticed." "But they didn't notice," Celestara said softly, landing beside her mate. "You did. And you didn't just give us energy crystals, you gave us hope. Sometimes that's worth more than all the credits in the colony." Nova, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly perked up. "Does this mean we can go back to school?" The adults laughed, and Administrator Powell nodded. "Yes, but not your old school. We're opening a new integrated academy, humans and dragons learning together." "Dibs on Asher," as my study partner Spark called out, causing another round of laughter. "And what about the Neodragon district?" Lisa asked, voicing the question many had been wondering about. "Tear it down," Luminox said firmly, surprising everyone. "Not to destroy it, but to rebuild it properly this time. No more separation, no more districts. One colony, one community." The council members nodded in agreement, and Administrator Powell made a note on her tablet. "Already in the plans. Construction begins next week. Though with dragon assistance, we might finish ahead of schedule." As the meeting continued, Asher slipped outside onto the observation deck. The colony looked different now, not just because of the repairs, but because of how people moved through it. Humans and dragons working together, talking, laughing. The barriers, both physical and social, were coming down one by one. "Credit for your thoughts," Celestara asked, joining him on the deck. "I was just thinking about that neural link console," Asher admitted. "You know, the one I was saving for. Do you regret spending the credits on us instead?" Asher grinned. "Are you kidding? Tommy Parker might have a fancy gaming console, but I have 3 dragon best friends who can shoot fire and fly. Pretty sure I won that trade." Aurora, Nova, and Spark chose that moment to zoom past the deck, showing off their newly mastered flight patterns. They'd created a game they called Star Dancing, weaving through space in complex formations that left trails of brightness in their wake. "Speaking of trading," Celestara said with a mysterious smile, "the council approved our request. Your new room in the family quarters will be ready next week, right next to ours." Asher's jaw dropped. "Really?" Mom agreed. "It was her idea. She said something about her son spending so much time with us anyway, we might as well make it official. Though she did insist on proper fireproofing." Looking out at the colony, his home, their home, Asher felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with dragon fire. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest choices. Sometimes all it took was one person willing to see past the surface, to recognize the light in others, even when it had grown dim. "You know what the best part is?" he said finally. "What's that?" "We never have to worry about running out of energy crystals again. Not when we've got something better." Oh, Celestara raised an elegant eyebrow. "And what's that?" Asher reached up and placed his hand on her shimmering scales. "Each other. 1 year later." The annual New Terra Colony Unity Festival was in full swing, transforming the once divided settlement into a spectacular display of lights, music, and most importantly, dragon fire. In the central plaza, where the old barrier between districts once stood, crowds gathered to watch the traditional dragon star dance. Luminox and Celestara led the performance, their scales blazing like captured supernovas as they soared through the artificial night sky. Behind them, Aurora, Nova, and Spark executed perfect spiral formations, their synchronized flames painting pictures in the air stories of friendship, courage, and change. Hard to believe it all started with a few energy crystals, Asher Martinez mused, watching from her spot on the newly constructed observation platform. As chief engineer of human dragon technologies, she'd helped design many of the improvements that now made the colony a model for other settlements. Asher, now 11 and sporting a jacket with the Academy's dragon and human crest, nodded. Best credits I ever spent. The Dragon Human Academy had become famous throughout the sector, with families actually moving to new Terra colony just so their children could attend. It turned out that when young dragons and humans learned together, they came up with innovations that neither species could have developed alone. Ready for your part, Celestara called down as she passed overhead. Asher gave her a thumbs up. This year, he was part of the ceremony, the first human ever invited to participate in the Dragon Star dance. He'd practiced for months with his dragon siblings, learning how to use the new gravity control harness they'd developed together. Remember, Aurora had told him during practice, it's not about the technology, it's about the trust. As Asher activated his harness and rose into the air to join his dragon family, he saw other changes too. The old Neodragon district had been transformed into a beautiful mixed residential area, with homes designed for both species to live comfortably side by side. The Energy Crystal Exchange had become a community center where resources were shared freely. Even Mr. Patel had expanded his shop to include a popular dragon tea room. Show them how it's done. Little brother Nova called as Asher took his position in the formation. Together, they created the final image of the night, a young boy and a dragon family, their silhouette rendered in starlight and flame against the colony's artificial sky. It wasn't just art, it was a symbol of everything their community had become. Later, as the celebrations wound down, Spark nuzzled against Asher's shoulder. Tell me again how we met. Really? You know the story by heart. Please? It's my favorite. Asher laughed, looking around at his expanded family, his mom chatting with Luminox about the colony's latest improvements, Celestara teaching other humans the basics of dragon culture, Aurora and Nova playing tag with their mixed group of human and dragon friends. Well, he began, grinning at his youngest dragon sibling. It all started when a 10-year-old boy noticed something nobody else did. And in the stories told at New Terra colony, they say that's how real change begins, not with grand plans or mighty forces, but with one small act of kindness that grows, like a dragon's flame, until it lights up the whole world.